morning or good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today we have speakers from the National Immigration Law Center, as well as from United We Dream, talking about the recent DACA decision by the Supreme Court. In terms of a few housekeeping issues, you are all in listen-only mode. If you have any questions or any technical challenges during this broadcast, you can type them into the chat box and we will respond to you. At the end of this presentation, there will also be a question and answer, which you can also put your questions into the chat box. After this webinar ends, there will be a recording that will be emailed out to you tomorrow, so you will have the link to view the recording as well as the slides. I'll now turn it over to Diana Plago from the National Immigration Law Center.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I know we're gathering here after an exciting win at the Supreme Court last Thursday, where the Supreme Court ruled in our favor that DACA gets to remain and be reinstated to the state it was before the termination. So this is an exciting win for all of our communities, and I'm really excited to be joining you here today with some really great speakers from the NILC team and also from United We Dream. So next slide, please. So just to go over very quickly what the agenda will look like. First, we're going to turn it over to Sana Abrar from United We Dream, who's really going to just ground us in the moment that we're in and how we're going to respond as a movement to this moment. Then we'll turn it over to my colleague, Myra, who will talk with us about what exactly happened with the Supreme Court decision and really break down what happened in the court. And then finally, I will be joining you again as a speaker to go over federal advocacy related to DACA and other things that can be done at the state and local level. And lastly, as was mentioned, we will have a Q&A portion at the end. So all your lines are muted, but you can be chiming in with questions in the chat box throughout that we will address at the end. Next slide, please. And I'm really happy to introduce you to Sana Abrar from United We Dream to join us for this first section. Sana?
Thank you so much, Diana. Hi, everybody. I am so pleased to be here with you all, particularly in the scenario that we're in. You'll see it on the title slide. We won. Now we're going to talk about what does that mean? So I don't know where you all were at the moment that the Supreme Court issued the decision on Thursday, but I ask that you hold that moment close to your heart as much as we had to be separate and celebrating virtually. I think this is definitely a moment, June 18th, that we will remember forever, especially as we are united in our long-term fight under the collective racial justice umbrella of fighting for justice and equity for immigrants across the country. So on June 18th, we saw the Supreme Court reject Trump's white supremacist agenda and side with DACA recipients, side with DACA recipients' families, side with undocumented individuals and families all across America and allies who've been fighting for years to continue to keep this program afloat and to keep it protected. DACA is an example of an investment. It's an example of investing in communities to create solutions and not harms. And we all know that DACA has always been more than work permits. It's been about protections from deportation, and particularly during this administration that has built out ICE, Border Patrol, funding for a wall, and used hateful racist rhetoric to scapegoat immigrants and communities of color. We know that investments and opportunities like DACA, like the DACA program, are more important than ever to continue to protect immigrant youth and families from Trump's deportation force. Now, I also want to recognize the moment that this all happened in. I bring to your attention the second bullet that I've been trying to reiterate over and over again, no matter what movement space I'm in, which is that the conditions of this moment, the DACA win, the SCOTUS decision, would not have been possible without the organizing of Black youth, of Black-led organizations who are making this country reckon with the role of police in the murders and targeting of Black people. As I said at the top, the immigrant justice movement is part of a larger collective movement for racial justice, and that is all centered upon investing in Black people, investing in Black communities. As long as these immediate investments don't happen, as long as there is not a divestment from the militarized forces that target and kill Black people, we will all not be free. I also recognize that this happened on June 18th, the day before Juneteenth, and national historic actions this past weekend, led by Black youth, led by Black organizations, to celebrate Black joy, to bring people together, to bring allies and accomplices together in Washington, D.C., and in communities across America to continue the fight. And I want to mark this note as saying that DACA, the win at the Supreme Court, is a step forward, but it is not the end-all be-all. Obviously, we continue to fight for permanent solutions. We continue to fight for legislation that helps people without hurting people. And more broadly, just like the movement for Black lives, just like the work that Black-led organizations are doing, we are not just fighting for citizenship. We are fighting for citizenship with humanity, citizenship with dignity, because we know that papers in this country do not necessarily protect Black people from police. And so we continue to take note and echo and follow the lead of Black organizing to fight for citizenship with dignity. Finally, I want to note that, one of our big top lines is we won and Trump lost. I encourage you all, in whatever conversations you're in, whether with press, whether with your organizations, whether with your networks or membership organizations, continue to beat that drum. We won and he lost. We know it gets under his skin, and we saw that happen this weekend with his rally in Tulsa. But I also want to note this other top line, which is, as long as Trump is in the White House, we will see attacks on immigrants, on Black people, and communities of color. We saw his tweet not even 24 hours after the Supreme Court decision on Friday morning, promising that he was pursuing another strategy to try to end the DACA program again. Again, to this president, we say, we won, you lost. And this November, we see that as another opportunity to say that once again. So in order for this decision to stand, in order for us to continue to fight for solutions that help people without hurting people, we are saying that the American people have a choice to make this November. It is a pivotal year, and we must continue to bring that top line up for all of our networks, for folks who have the power to vote, because again, as long as he is in the White House, our communities continue to be in danger. Thank you all.
Thank you, Shauna. And now I think we can go on to the next slide, and I'm really excited to introduce you all to Myra Hochin, who is staff attorney at the National Immigration Law Center, and she's going to break down exactly what happened in the courtroom and what the court issued on the DACA decision on Thursday. Myra?
Thanks so much, Diana, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're still quite thrilled from the decision that we received last Thursday. I want to start briefly with a quick recap on how we got to last Thursday's decision. So you may recall that when Trump ended DACA back in September of 2017, there were several lawsuits that were filed immediately after that decision to challenge the process by which the government had ended DACA, and arguing that the process violated federal law, specifically the Administrative Procedure Act. Now, in late 2018, the government asked the Supreme Court to review the decisions by the district courts in those cases, which had all ultimately concluded that the Trump administration had acted unlawfully when it ended DACA, and which had resulted in 2 injunctions being issued that allowed for individuals to start applying for renewal applications and continue to be eligible to apply for renewals. Now, when the government asked the Supreme Court to review those cases, at that time, the appellate court still hadn't issued any decisions. They were still reviewing those appeals. And as a result, the government was taking this extraordinary step of asking the court to review those cases before there was a judgment. on the merits of the appellate courts. By the time that the Supreme Court granted the government's request to review each of those three cases, the Ninth Circuit had already issued a decision in the Regents case, and so the cases in California had an appellate court decision that was ready for the Supreme Court review, while the other two cases, the cases in New York, specifically Wolf versus Batalla Vidal, as well as the DC case and Trump versus NAACP, those still only had the decisions by the district courts. Last year, when the Supreme Court granted the government's request to review all of those three cases, it was surprising that it had granted all three, and ultimately the court scheduled oral argument on the three cases for November 12th, 2019. Now, after several months of anxious waiting, we finally received a decision and a tremendous victory last week. And I'd like to turn to the next slide so that we can dive into what the decision says and some of its implications. Next slide, please. Thank you. So last Thursday, on a 5-4 opinion that was written by Chief Justice Roberts, the court concluded first that courts have legal authority to review the government's ending of DACA. That was the first key question before the court. And second, that the DACA termination was unlawful because it violated federal law, specifically the Administrative Procedure Act. On the first question on reviewability, the court reasoned that DACA was not merely a non-enforcement policy, as the government was arguing, but instead was a program that was providing for affirmative immigration relief. The benefits that it allowed individuals to apply for, such as work authorization, for example, are the type of benefits that courts are often called to protect. And because DACA was this affirmative program, the creation of DACA allowed for judicial review. The court also held that the two statutory provisions, which could have otherwise prevented courts from reviewing the case, did not apply because those provisions only apply when there's a challenge to a removal proceeding or where there's a general bar related to removals, which was not the case with DACA, given that DACA was this affirmative program. As to the Administrative Procedure Act, the court concluded that the government's termination was unlawful because DHS had not considered several important issues when it ended DACA. One of the defining features of the DACA program, as the court said, is its protections from deportations, as well as the other benefits that DACA recipients are eligible for. And yet DHS did not draw a distinction between deportation protections or those benefits that individuals can apply for when it decided to end the program or how to go about in ending the program. The court also reasoned that the decision was flawed because there are several reliance interests at stake on behalf of DACA recipients who have had DACA for several years, as well as their employers, their communities, and their family members that the government did not consider adequately when it decided to end the program. And so as a result, the combination of these failures did not meet the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act, and the government's termination was arbitrary and capricious. Next slide. Now, I want to draw attention to this quote from the opinion because I want to recognize that last Thursday's decision was a monumental win, and it was a win that really came about because of the thousands of individuals who have supported DACA in a myriad of ways. In this quote, the court recognizes the significance of DACA to DACA recipients, to their families, communities, employers, and the economy. This recognition shows that the court truly heard everyone who has been fighting for DACA in one way or another over the last years. From every brave plaintiff who rose up to challenge this decision, to the hundreds of organizers who participated in marches towards the Supreme Court, those who held rallies outside the court or who sat in line for hours so that documented individuals could be inside the courtroom on the day of oral argument, and to all those who shared their stories and provided their support through submitting amicus briefs in support of the DACA program. This was a win that really came from everyone's support and everyone's interest in fighting for a program that allows documented individuals to remain in this country and to be here with their families. Next slide. So ultimately, as a result of the court's conclusion, the court set aside the decision. The court set aside the memo that was issued in 2017 and which ended DACA. As a result of them setting aside this memo or vacating the memo, what this means is that the memo that was issued by Secretary Napolitano back in 2012 still stands, and so the last memo is no longer in place. The original DACA memo remains in place, and DACA continues to operate under the same terms and conditions as it was when it was created. Now, I want to note briefly that while the majority of last Thursday's decision was favorable, there was one part of it that was not as favorable. Specifically, the court addressed the equal protection claims that had been raised across these cases and concluded that the equal protection claims had not been sufficiently pled, and as a result, the parties had not shown that the government's decision to end DACA was motivated by racial animus. There was a dissent by Justice Sotomayor on this ultimate outcome. I think many of us on this call recognize that the numerous actions by this administration show that they are continuing to further a racist agenda in every action they take. And so we think it's unfortunate that the court reached that conclusion, but it was nonetheless something that was also addressed by the DACA decision, which may not have received as much coverage. And so I did want to highlight it briefly. Next slide. And so what does this mean? First, USCIS can continue to accept and process renewal applications. And second, because of the Supreme Court's opinion, DHS is required to again begin accepting initial applications. This would be for first-time applicants from individuals who have never had DACA, but who are eligible for it under the same criteria that was issued in the 2012 memo. And it also requires USCIS to accept applications for advanced parole. Now, we don't know whether the Trump administration will take any action limiting these options. So we're still waiting for further guidance from the USCIS as to how it will start to process these applications and whether there will be any modifications to the way that it processes them. So if you are considering submitting a renewal application or a first-time application, we strongly encourage you to speak with an immigration attorney so that you can properly assess your circumstance and the best next step. And lastly, I want to note that NILC and federal partners, including UWD, are working on guidance for DACA recipients and practitioners as to what the Supreme Court's decision means, and we will be sharing additional guidance soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Myra. So this is Diana Plago joining you again just to talk a little bit about what's happening legislatively. You know, in the lead up to a decision, there was certainly advocacy efforts to extend our, as a DACA recipient, extend our work permits and protection from deportation. While there were also, I think maybe many folks on this webinar have seen that there were rumors of the administration preparing for a decision in order to essentially use a win for them, which would have been a loss for us, in order to pressure Congress into passing wider immigration bills. And so what is happening now that we have this win, right? So I think in our view, the Supreme Court win really changes how the administration and Congress will react with regard to just legislative solution. Obviously, this reduces the urgency for folks to find something to act on in a way that is beneficial to the immigrant community, because now we can't be used as bargaining chips essentially for the long wish list of the administration that we have seen over and over again of harmful changes to the immigration system, drastic cuts to family immigration system, to diversity visa, all these other things that we've seen in the past. And so, there's no telling what Congress exactly will do. If any member of Congress will try to initiate negotiations, if the administration will still try. They've already, said that they will continue to basically attack the program and continue to attack immigrant communities. And so we know that all of this is very much up in the air, and we'll have to see how Congress reacts. But right now, I'll talk a little bit about what is happening in Congress. And what is happening right now is that due to what is happening in our country and the uprisings against police brutality, against the systemic racism and white supremacy in this nation right now, Congress is responding, and the House and Senate are working on separate police reform bills. Separately, we're still in a pandemic, and so the House recently passed the HEROES Act, a bill which contained many positive provisions for immigrant communities, and Senate negotiations are expected mid-July right now to put forth another COVID-19 relief bill. And so that's what's happening right now, and I think right now our asks are to really continue defending the DACA program. We are demanding that USCIS immediately restore the DACA program to its original state before termination, just as the court is telling it to do, right? So that would, of course, mean continuing to accept the renewal applications that they've been doing, thanks to the court injunctions that we've won in the past, to begin accepting those initial applications and to resume processing advanced parole. And as always, we will continue to call for permanent protections that, as Sana said, help people without hurting people. For us, those an example that we point to is the Dream and Promise Act, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide, as a bill, an example of something that we as a community can get behind, because it provides solutions and provides pathways for immigrant communities without tying it to harmful enforcement provisions. And of course, we also continue to call on Congress to include relief, these automatic extensions of our status and protection from deportation for DACA and TPS communities. We can't forget that TPS communities are still waiting on their court cases to be figured out, and they're still in need of relief. And so we're going to continue to call for those automatic extensions of that status and protection for deportation for all of our communities. And we also continue to call on them to include economic relief and healthcare access to everyone, regardless of immigration status, in the next relief bill, really supporting a lot of the provisions that were included in the HEROES Act. And as always, continue to call on Congress to defund ICE and CBP. We know that these are agencies that have hurt and continue to hurt our immigrant communities across the country. And so we must continue to hold them accountable for those actions and not continue just funding them when we know that they're committing these human rights violations in detention camps and across the interior of the country. And as Sana said, we're standing in solidarity with Black lives in this moment. And so we are going to continue to uplift the ask that our Black sisters and brothers are making right now of our country and of Congress. And I'll talk just briefly about the Dream and Promise Act next. So next slide, please. So for those wondering, so what is the Dream and Promise Act and where is it? As I mentioned before, this is a bill that we really look to as kind of like the North Star. Like, this is what we should be aiming for when we think of solutions for our immigrant community. The Dream and Promise Act is a bill that would provide a pathway to citizenship for immigrant youth, both with DACA, TPS, and DED communities. It doesn't contain harmful enforcement provisions, money for a wall, cuts to immigration in ways that are harmful to communities of color. It's a bill that provides just a solution for people needing that pathway. The House passed it in June of 2019, so it's been sitting in Congress without any further action. Senator Mitch McConnell has not taken it up for a vote, refuses to do so. We believe that if it was brought to a vote, that it would pass, right? Because the American people support these provisions, and if Congress was responding to what the American people want, this is a bill that would pass, right? And so now, what's next? Now that we're in this moment, we have this victory in the courts, and this is where a solution for DACA recipients and for more TPS and DED communities, where does this stand? So as I mentioned, we're going to continue calling for protections that help our communities without also hurting our communities. That, something that not just helps me, but that also helps my parents, right? And we're going to continue to call on members of Congress to do the same, to really champion bills and solutions that provide protections for all of our communities. So we're expanding like what we ask of them, and then of course we are encouraging people to, if you believe you are eligible for the DACA program now, maybe you didn't get a chance to submit your initial application before it was terminated and that option was taken away from you. We really encourage you to, as Myra said, talk to an attorney, a VA accredited representative, about what your options look like and whether you can begin preparing to submit that. Definitely encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity. Our communities have won. For years we've been fighting for these protections, and you know, it's not the permanent solutions that we hope for and that we deserve, but we encourage you to take advantage of them. Next slide, please. And then another thing that we encourage people to do is to not focus exclusively on what's happening at the federal level. There are so many things that our communities can be doing at the state and local level to protect our communities there. And sometimes, you know, depending on how these governments are made up, you know, we might have more opportunities to advance things at the state and local level. These are just a few of the examples of what your communities can be doing. And I'm just going to go briefly over what these are, but we definitely encourage you to look more into them, to also get involved in your local community. Is there an organization that's working on these issues that you can be a part of to advance protections for everyone, not just for DACA recipients in your communities? So one is to disentangle law enforcement from immigration enforcement. Make sure that your local law enforcement is not collaborating with ICE and detaining people for them. This is how we can prevent a simple traffic stop from turning into a deportation case. This is so huge and important. Another is to pass tuition equity policies to make sure that immigrants have access to higher education regardless of our immigration status. That includes working to make sure that it's affordable for everybody, increasing financial aid options that are available to immigrant communities, because not many are. Also, we can work to expand eligibility for driver's license and state-issued IDs, regardless of immigration status, right? Think of how often IDs are needed for everyday things, and often we can take them for granted, but they make a huge difference in people's lives. And this can also be the difference between someone getting pulled over and for a traffic violation and turning it into something worse. We can also work with our different communities to pass safe space policies, whether this be in hospitals, health centers, whether it be at your high school or at your college campus, or in just, you know, or in other courthouses and things like that. Working with your local community to make sure that people are knowing their rights, know where, you know, if ICE has access to a certain location or not, and establishing policies and procedures for how to protect immigrants if something like that does happen. All of this goes a long way in protecting people and making sure that they feel safe, for example, to even go to the hospital in the first place. And lastly, this is one thing that also goes a long way. When people are going through immigration procedures, they are not guaranteed access to counsel. And so we can work with our local governments to provide funding for deportation defense programs to increase that representation, because we know that when people have access to representation, they're more likely to have a positive outcome. So all of these things are just a few of the examples that that folks can be using to work on in your local communities. And like I said before, we definitely encourage you to be in touch with a local organization that's working on some or all of these or different issues to advance those protections at the state and local level. Next slide, please. And so these are just a few of the resources, and again, we'll follow up via email, so you don't have to jot this down right now, but we have resources on the Dream and Promise Act, so you know what a bill that we can get behind looks like. Next slide, please. And of course, a lot of the information that was mentioned here as far as the guidance to DACA recipients or those eligible now, we have posted online as well, and we have lots of resources on the NILC DACA page as well, with, you know, not just the guidance that we're issuing now after the Supreme Court win, but so many other frequently asked questions that you might have, you could probably find on our resource page. Next slide, please. And then I'll leave this up during the question and answer portion. But now I think we'll just turn it over to you all. I know we've been getting some questions throughout, so I will be looking to the chat box now. But please feel free to reach out to any one of the speakers on today's webinar if you have any questions. So let's see. Question number 1. So if the administration refuses to accept new DACA applications, can we go back to court to require that they do accept new cases? Myra, would you like to take that?
Sure, I can start. So I think it really depends on what the administration chooses to do and how it goes about it, right? So if as of right now, because the Supreme Court vacated or set aside the memo that ended DACA, technically the government does have another opportunity if it wishes to end DACA to do so, but to do so in a way that's unlawful. No one as of now has ever argued that the government cannot completely end DACA. They just simply couldn't do it in the way that they did it because they provided absolutely no reason explanation for doing so. Right now, the Supreme Court's decision does require USCIS to continue to accept applications. And so if they were to stop categorically accepting applications, that would be going against what the Supreme Court's decision says. It's hard to know whether or how we could go back to the court. It really would depend on how the government goes about stopping to process those applications, whether it's doing it in a way that's unlawful and unlawfully discriminating against DACA recipients. And there's just several factors that we would have to consider to decide how and whether we could be going back to courts. For now, they are expected to continue to process applications.
Thank you, Myra. I think this is very similar, and you kind of just touched on this, but is the question that we have is, what is the timeline for USCIS to restart the initial and advanced parole application process? Is there a mandate that USCIS must comply with what they've been told to restart? So do we have an idea of a timeline, Myra?
We don't, and perhaps Sana could chime in, but as of right now, we don't have any sense of what that timeline could be. All we know is that USCIS is expected to start processing those applications. That should include initial applications as well. And for those of you who are interested in advanced parole, the 2012 DACA memorandum did allow for individuals to apply for advanced parole. So presumably USCIS would resume with processing applications for both initials and advanced parole applications. But for now, it's uncertain what that timeline would be or whether they would be making any changes to how they will process the applications. We are still waiting for further guidance from USCIS on whether there will be any changes to these practices.
Thank you. And then this, I don't know, Sana, if you want to add anything, feel free.
I think I saw a question pop up in the chat, so it might partly address it about what can be done. So I completely, echo the answers so far on what is happening and what is the state of play. I will just, get a little political here, which is the highest court in the land has ordered that the Trump administration and that USCIS heed their order and return DACA to the original state of the program in 2012. And so far, as it stands, we have a winning case where we won and Trump lost, and USCIS still hasn't, as you have seen and as you have heard, has not issued new protocol or new guidance. On the advocacy side, we think it is incredibly important that USCIS, that the Trump administration are hearing from our people, allies, advocates, directly impacted folks, that they need to heed the court's order. They need to start accepting new applications. It is totally unacceptable that they are continuing to wait, or as I think we understand, that I don't think they're just waiting. I think they're trying to figure out ways, as we saw in the Trump tweet from Friday, to get out of doing this and try and submit a quote unquote enhanced paperwork to try and end the program again. But in the meantime, we have a situation where the executive branch is not heeding the order of the judicial branch. In case helpful, I'll share with the organizers of this event a link to a petition United We Dream launched last week. In case it is helpful for you, for your networks to take part, this is a petition that we are circulating that allows for participants to essentially send a letter, send an email directly to the acting DHS Secretary, Chad Wolf, to heed the order of the Supreme Court. So definitely think that there are many opportunities to try and get USCIS to comply, and one of them being this kind of grassroots opportunity to push folks to join this petition. So I'll make sure that that can also be sent around.
Thank you, Sana. We have a lot of really great questions. I'm trying to look through all of these to make sure we get to all of them. We have a good one here. Someone said, thank you for uplifting the movement for Black lives. Can you say more about how Black youth organizing contributed to this victory? Sana, would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So I mean, I don't think we have the time for a history lesson, but I think one of the lessons that I've learned, particularly in the last few weeks, because I will position myself as somebody who is continuing to learn each and every day, that the immigration victories or the movements forward or the steps forward for the immigrant rights movement would not have been made possible without the leadership of Black people, right? Whether we're talking about the civil rights movement or of the 1960s or right now, right? When we're talking about Black young people, movement for Black lives, collectives of Black youth coming out and sharing their stories and talking about the real impact, not only of police brutality on Black people, but also of the need to invest in Black people. I will say that, you know, a parallel effort that NILC and United We Dream are involved in, along with groups like Detention Watch Network, is called the Defund Hate Coalition, which is a coalition that has truly followed the lead of Movement for Black Lives organizations and the coalition itself by echoing a divest, invest framework. That as long as we divest from militarized forces in our communities, whether that's police, whether that's ICE, whether that's Border Patrol, and invest that money and those resources and that capacity into solutions that help people without hurting people. Examples being like the right to free education, the right to health care for all, the right to being able to move across borders regardless of immigration status, the right to just live and thrive regardless of immigration status, regardless of you know, what the color of your skin is. That is something that has been hugely informed by Black-led movements, the divest invest piece, which I think with our Home is Here coalition and DACA victory is what we continue to push in our messaging, which is we can't just fight for permanent solutions. We can't be blindsided by the work that is being done to ramp up and increase funding to ICE and CBP. As you heard in Diana's summary of asks of Congress, we are continuing to call for HR 6, continuing to push for extensions of work permits and solutions for people, while at the same time calling for the defunding of agencies of ICE and CBP. As long as people are being discriminated against because of their immigration status and militarized forces are being used to target those individuals, our folks will continue to be in danger. And I think, you know, to end here, I do think that there's a lot of learning that's been happening in a cross-movement way as we've been talking to, at least within United We Dream, folks from our network who are undocumented, who many of whom are non-Black immigrant young people who are going to protests, who are showing up, who are trying to also learn and take that back to many of their non-Black family members and have conversations about, unfortunately, the pervasive amount of anti-Blackness that exists in our communities. So one of the things that we've learned is how do we continue to center the role of Black movement leaders and Black youth in our work? How do we continue to be thankful and show gratitude, but also show up? And then how do we ensure that, particularly in non-Black immigrant spaces, we are leaning into these courageous conversations with family, with loved ones, with friends about anti-Blackness? And I speak for myself here. I've grown up, as a South Asian woman, as a Muslim woman, as a non-Black individual who has admittedly, chosen not to engage in conversations about anti-Blackness when I hear it in my community. And now we are learning lessons of how that's actually not helpful. That actually doesn't create spaces of learning, and that doesn't broaden the movement, right? When we talk about collective movement for racial justice, it keeps us siloed and separated. So those are just a few learnings, but happy to follow up separately too, to talk more about it, because I'm sure there's a lot of good conversation to be had there.
Thank you, Sana. That was a really great answer. Yeah, we definitely don't have time to go over all of history, but that was really wonderful. Now we have a lot of questions that are kind of in the similar vein, so I'll try to summarize, and Myra, I'll turn to you to talk a little bit more about it. We're getting a few folks who are asking, well, you said to talk to an immigration attorney. I'm asking you, should I go ahead and apply now before USCIS puts out official guidance? And I think one thing we have to remind folks is that we are not immigration attorneys. We don't know your specific case individually. And so we cannot provide you with legal advice in that way that you're seeking. You will have to talk to someone on an individual basis. But Myra, can you speak more on that, just to clarify that point, but then also about, for the folks who are wondering, should they go ahead and submit now? What can they be doing right now? Myra?
Sure, and thank you for that disclaimer, Diana. I think part of the reason why we have to provide that disclaimer is, while we are attorneys, we are not direct immigration attorneys, and so there's many considerations and factors that need to be discussed with you as you're deciding whether to file either a renewal or a first-time application for DACA. So we strongly encourage you to connect with someone who does work on direct immigration applications, specifically DACA applications, and can go through those series of questions with you. If you have any questions and need a referral, we are happy to provide one. Generally, we are aware that some individuals have already started to submit new DACA applications. As we mentioned before, we don't necessarily know how USCIS will be processing those applications. And so if you've been following any of the social media, you see that there's some March for the President expressing some hesitancy on whether they will be processing applications in the immediate future. They are required to continue to process those applications, but it's still uncertain how USCIS will be processing them and whether there will be any changes to them. Because of that, as of right now, it's a little too early to go through any of the risks that one would want to calculate when deciding whether to submit that application. And so because of those risks and because of the uncertainty and the timeline for what that would be, we are strongly recommending that you speak with a local immigration attorney who can actually review your case and properly advise you based on a series of factors on what your situation is.
Thank you, Myra. And we'll turn it over to a slightly different question right now. So someone asked, what can community health centers do to support immigrant patients and documented employees? Well, the great news for you is that we have some resources on that on our website. And I'll see if I can pull them up and share in the chat during this. But certainly one of the things that health centers can do is, as I mentioned toward the end of my presentation, is to put forth policies that make it clear, for example, that when folks are entering that space, that is private property, and that therefore, if immigration enforcement were to come in, that they would need some sort of warrant. Educating your staff, for example, on know your rights and whether they have, to be able to inform your patients whether they can remain silent. These are just like little simple things, and I'm happy to point you into the direction of more resources on this. But I think being a safe space for all of your immigrant patients, not just your documented ones, is really a great first step, because people will feel more comfortable and safe going there, knowing that immigration enforcement, that they're safe from potential immigration enforcement there. And specifically on documented employees, one thing that comes to mind, I know that, for example, Teach for America, I believe, yeah, they have many documented um, teachers, and they support them. They create programs to support those who are going through that together. They also help support them in covering their application fees, because it is a substantial amount of money. So those are just like some of the ways that you can do that. We have more resources on that as well. So we're happy to kind of follow up with those. And now to turn it over to another legal question. Let me see if I can pull this up 1 second. So we have someone who is asking about a different case brought by Texas. Myra, so I think this will go back to you. Can you talk about how the lawsuit brought by Texas and other states challenging the DACA program that was filed quite a bit of time ago, how that affects the program right now, where that is? What does it have to do with what's happening right now?
Sure, and that's a really good question. So we focused for now on the cases that challenged the government's decision to end DACA, but we didn't discuss the separate lawsuit that is in Texas, where Texas and several other states are challenging the legality of DACA program itself. It's important to remember that the Supreme Court did not address the legality of DACA, or at least not in its majority opinion. And so there is this separate case that is happening in Texas where the states have actually been challenging the program itself, arguing that the program is unlawful. And so the injunctions, which had been in place until now, shouldn't be lawful either, because there shouldn't be DACA in general. In that case, last week there was actually an update following the Supreme Court decision. Before the Supreme Court, as the case was reviewing the cases pending before it, that court, which is Judge Haynen's court, had actually stayed those proceedings because it was waiting for news from the Supreme Court. Now that we have the decision from the Supreme Court, Judge Haynen has actually ordered the parties there to file a joint status report, and also to submit a schedule by July 24th, given the recent ruling from the Supreme Court. So that case will resume, and we should, by the end of July, have a better sense of what the next steps are going to be in that case, to figure out how much time we have for that case to be resolved, and for there to be an actual ruling on the merits that would actually focus on the legality of DACA itself.
Thank you, Myra. We have another, I think, legal question. I'm just going to go to you again. That's really interesting regarding the equal protection clause that you mentioned. So someone is asking, the court could have simply said that we've decided on the APA issue and we will not address the equal protection claim. But instead, they unequivocally said that they did not sufficiently plead. And this person's view says, after the case in the travel ban case, the equal protection clause has no teeth because of the Trump administration. If the Trump administration and their actions don't meet the standard, then what will? They're saying it's scared that they decided to say pleadings are not sufficient. And in a way, it seems as if the Supreme Court is giving another green light to racist policy. This person wants to know, am I reading too much into this, or is this a fair view? Myra?
Sure, and so you're right, to the person who's asking this, you're right that the Supreme Court did not actually have to reach that question. It wasn't one of the two questions that was directly presented to the court, though it is a question that has come up across the various cases that were before it. So one, no, the Supreme Court did not have to say anything regarding equal protection. It's interesting and really unfortunate that it did, given the ultimate conclusion. I think what comes out of this is that the court has effectively made it increasingly difficult for anyone to bring equal protection claims, specifically in the immigration context, where you're focusing on Latino Latinos who are being disparately impacted by the Trump administration's policies, which we continue to believe are driven by racism against this community, but which, as a result of the court's opinion, has significantly weakened the ability for one to show that the disparate impact on Latino communities is actually evidence that would be helpful to show that the government is acting based on discriminatory animus. So yes, it will be really difficult to continue to bring these kinds of claims. With that said, I think there's many cases that are currently challenging different immigration policies continue to have those claims at play, and I think there will be likely arguments continue to be made as to why this administration is actually being driven by racism, even if the Supreme Court's opinion seemed to disregard some of those statements.
Thank you, Myra. This next question, I think, is one that I will address or take a first stab at, and Sana, you're welcome to chime in. So the question we have is, what is the outlook of HR 6, the Dream and Promise Act, in the Senate looking like? Will it have traction in the July hearings? So just to clarify, there aren't any expected hearings in July. It's the COVID-19 relief bills that we expect will be increasing conversation in the Senate in July. Unfortunately, Senator Mitch McConnell, who's the majority leader in the Senate at this time, has refused to take any action on HR 6 and will not bring it to the floor for a vote. So unfortunately, it's just at a standstill. And like we mentioned, we continue to call for these permanent protections. We want to see that bill come to the floor for a vote, but the majority leader has, essentially made it clear that they're not interested in doing that. And so that's why we're going to just keep fighting. And I think this is also very tied to another question that someone asked, and Sana, I will also turn this one over to you specifically, since you did mention November. This person is asking, my understanding is that the current USCIS leadership is in line with the Trump agenda, and it seems to me that anything pro-DACA coming from Congress will never be signed by President Trump. So wouldn't it be a better investment of our very limited resources to educate voters and vote Trump and any of his allies out in November? So will you speak to that a little bit?
Sure thing. I am in complete agreement. Yes. So I think, again, like reviewing the top lines, right? Our action items are essentially, number one, to again continue to frame this victory as an unequivocal win, because it is setting us up in a good place for November. So as much as we can say, Trump, you lost, we won, and DACA is here to stay, and all of our activities, tactics, litigation work will be centered on continuing to keep it here to stay. So that's kind of summarizing a lot of the conversation we've been having here on how do we keep this victory going? How do we get USCIS to open up new applications? How do we ensure that we are defending ourselves thoroughly and to the best ability that we can, if this administration, as we think they will, try to issue another challenge to DACA. So continuing with the drumbeat of, we won, you lost, we're doing everything that we can to maintain this victory. And then number two, electoralizing the issue, right? I know that we're in a C3 space, so all I can say is I agree. November is going to be pivotal. Anything that we can continue to do to uplift the stories of DACA recipients, of the widespread support that American voters have for DACA recipients and their families, anything that we can do to continue to point the finger at Trump and say, this man being in the White House is a detriment to all of us, including undocumented communities all across the country. As long as he is in the White House, we will continue to be at immediate threat. We need to essentially have a change in leadership so that we can move forward and not backwards.
Thank you, Sana. And on that note of moving forward, I think this is a good place to, wrap it up. We're getting close to the hour, and I think we've been able to answer a lot of the questions. A lot of these were very similar, and I think the panelists did a great job of kind of addressing them all. And so thank you. Just want to say thank you to everyone who's joining us. And also just very quickly, is there anything else, Sana or Myra, that you would like to just add that you didn't get to address before we close out?
I think there's been maybe one question earlier regarding judicial procedures that come next. And so there's a couple of procedures that are at play. One is we expect that there will be a copy of the certified order that will be making its way down to the lower courts from the Supreme Court's decision. Generally, the court has about 25 days to issue that order. And then separately, technically the government could always file a petition for rehearing. They also have 25 days to do that. We don't necessarily expect that that will be the case, but those are the two potential judicial legal next steps that could be implicated.
Thank you. Sana, do you have anything to add?
Yes. So I said, I prefaced with talking about celebration and victory. Actually, just in a few minutes at 1 p.m. Eastern time, we are going to be hosting with Home is Here, the DACA Victory Virtual Rally. So I have shared with our organizers here a link to the YouTube channel where this will go live in just a few minutes. You can also watch on United We Dream's Facebook page. We will be going live there. There's going to be a bunch of great performers, artists, speakers, movement leaders, documented and undocumented leadership who will be using this moment for a wonderful victory lap. So encourage you to join if you can. The rally will be going from about 1 p.m. Eastern to about 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. So drop in while you can.
Yes, definitely encourage folks to join into the celebration and really bask in this victory that, as was mentioned, was really made possible by immigrant youth fighting the fight for such a long time. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be following up tomorrow or the next day with more resources, the recording of the webinar in case you had to jump off early or anything like that. So thank you again for joining us. And please just remember that the fight continues. We're here with you, and that we hope that you will continue to join us as we go on to more victory. Thank you.